again, and thanks for joining us for this Friday's edition of Alaska Weather. First graphic here, hazardous weather graphic for the Yukon Delta, as well as Norton Sound into the Kuskokwim Valley, St. Lawrence Island, Bering Strait coast. High wind warnings are out actually through Sunday for winds out of the east and northeast, gusting anywhere from 50 to 65 miles per hour. And then over the interior, those are mostly wind chill advisories out for the next day or so, tonight into tomorrow, in some cases tomorrow night. And then other areas have winter weather advisories due to the blowing snow that's mixed in, reducing visibilities. But look for wind chills in the advisory areas there, as low as 55 degrees below zero. And for the Copper River Basin, that wind chill advisory is out until 6 p.m. this evening. And then the blizzard warning for the Susitna Valley, or I'm sorry, the Madnuska Valley blizzard warning's out until 8 p.m. this evening, as well as the high wind warning for Northeast Prince William Sound, Valdez, Keystone Canyon. And those areas, again, that's out until about 8 p.m. as winds are coming down currently and will continue to come down. Should fall below warning level, again, roughly around 8 p.m. tonight. And then for the Panhandle, winter storm warnings covering much of the southeast coast, especially for tonight for the southern areas and probably through Sunday for the northern areas, with anywhere from 8 to 16 inches of snow possible in some locations. Along the coast there, you see a little less winter weather advisory for snow from Port Alexander to Sitka, although Sitka was carrying heavy snow for a while this afternoon. And from there, taking a look at satellite imagery, you can see a band of clouds rolling northward and to a certain extent pulling back westward along the eastern North Gulf Coast. That brought a couple inches of snow into the southern Panhandle during the day today. Ketchikan picked up anywhere from 1 to 3 inches, give or take there. And Heidelberg, about 34 degrees. They're seeing wet snow at times. And then the snow really cuts off about the mid-southeast coast. They're only not that much, less than a half inch falling up to the central Panhandle, and none really to the north. And then a little bit there over Yakutat, they picked up a little bit of new snow earlier on, but the area there, the band having been pushed southward there, south of Kodiak Island, yesterday was mostly oriented from west to east. You can still see that little orientation here at 5 a.m., but those northeast winds that gusted as high as 70 to 85 miles an hour in the Madnuska Valley and down into Cook Inlet, shoving that band southward across Kodiak Island, dropping temperatures in the upper 20s there with 40 to 50 mile an hour winds blowing across Kodiak, and also into Bristol Bay, colder air once again pulling southwestward there, and very cold over the interior. Barely getting above minus 50 this afternoon, places like Chicken to Eagle, and currently back down in the lower minus 50s, and warmer out to the west, but not as warm as it has been, with strong winds gusting upwards of 70 miles an hour along the southwest coast, Tuksuk Bay and Cape Romanzoff and those areas. On the and another disturbance coming down from the north there, bringing some clouds and light snow to the eastern Arctic coast and down toward the eastern North Slope areas. We're kind of cutting off there about Arctic Village. To the south, not much at all. You can see that weak disturbance up there along the Arctic coast. Not much in the way of any wind with that, just lower flying conditions, snow, fog. Otherwise, areas of blowing snow, reducing visibilities over southern Alaska. And again, the blizzard conditions in the Madnuska Valley today, after Palmer seeing winds gusting 77 miles per hour. Another report to the southwest there, just before the Glen and Parks highways branch off, had 83 miles per hour for a peak wind gust there. And Anchorage International Airport, 67 or 8 miles per hour. That's the highest wind gust recorded there since the great windstorm of March 2003. Otherwise, winds also diminishing over the Copper River Basin, with clouds sort of developing and increasing across the Kenai Peninsula areas, with the snow moving up into the northern Panhandle. For tonight, look for areas of snow for the Alaska Peninsula and possibly into the Copper River Basin as well. And snow on the increase for the Panhandle. Band of snow will begin to advance northwestward and then westward along the North Gulf Coast. And areas of snow will be on the increase over the eastern Copper River Basin and maybe even some light snow into areas north of the eastern Alaska Range, but those amounts will be quite light. Snow and blowing snow, not snow, drifting and blowing snow will continue in the windy areas over the central and southwest part of the state, with those high wind warnings continuing again along the southwest coast, Nunivak Island, St. Lawrence Island areas. Not too bad up to the north, some few clouds and lighter winds there with basically dry conditions, rain and snow showers out over the Aleutians. And for Christmas Eve, stays pretty breezy over areas of the central and southern interior. Not quite as windy tomorrow as what we saw today for south central Alaska, Mananuska, Susitna Valley areas, but still pretty breezy there in the Copper River Basin with areas of blowing snow and a little bit of new snow. And the winter storm warning will continue for the central and northern Panhandle through tomorrow afternoon, but warmer temperatures pushing into the south there. Look for rain over the southern Panhandle as temperatures push into the lower 40s at places like Klawock and Ketchikan, Metlakatla, and to a lesser extent over toward Misty Fjords, probably staying snow there. Otherwise, chance of some moisture for Kodiak Island, better chance for the Alaska Peninsula, that 970 millibar low there near Nelson Lagoon. Snow showers for the Pribilofs as colder air continues to move southwestward, being pulled down by those northeast winds. Rain and snow showers for the Aleutians. And then for the day Sunday, big storm moves into the northeast Pacific there with a front bringing gale and storm force winds up across the Gulf of Alaska into the North Gulf Coast and along the Panhandle. And it'll tighten the gradient up again with snow and blowing snow. Copper River Basin down into Bristol Bay, southern Kuskokwim Valley. Stays breezy over the central interior, but dry with cold conditions continuing, and then light winds for the North Slope and the Arctic coast. Lows tonight, 5 to 15 northern Panhandle, 25 to 32 in the south. A little below zero for south central Alaska in the minus 20s, Copper River Basin and the Kuskokwim Valley, and 0 to 10 below for Bristol Bay, mid-20s, Kodiak Island. Highs tomorrow in the minus teens for the Kuskokwim Valley, Copper River Basin, and 13 to 22 for the northern Panhandle, but into the lower 40s down to the south, followed by lows in the upper 30s for the southern Panhandle, and still on the chilly side to the north there, and 15 to 30 below for the Kuskokwim Valley, and anywhere from 10 below to 10 above south central Alaska. Near zero for Bristol Bay, followed by highs 10 to 20 for Bristol Bay. Not so far below zero for the Copper River Basin or Kuskokwim Valley, and into the mid-teens for south central Alaska. 25 to 30 for the northern Panhandle, lower 40s to the south, up to the north. Tonight a little milder, but still in the 30s to 40s below zero, and single numbers out toward the Seward Peninsula. Highs 25 to 35 below for the eastern interior, and in the teens, Seward Peninsula, and single numbers to near 10 for the western and central Arctic coast. Lows the following morning, 20 to 45 below in the east, and 10 below to 5 above in the west, followed by highs staying chilly over the eastern interior and 10 to 15.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather for Saturday morning. IFR, central, western, North Slope, and the western Arctic coast. Also some IFR along the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula, northern Kodiak Island area, and North Gulf Coast into the northern Panhandle. Another batch of IFR pushing into the southern southeast coast. And IFR moving northward there across central eastern Copper River Basin, right up to and a little bit to the north of the eastern Alaska Range. And for the afternoon, that area continues to advance northward. IFR there almost up to Eagle now, with marginal VFR past the Yukon River, and coming into south central Alaska, some marginal VFR with IFR for Bristol Bay. Also marginal VFR over the southeast coast. Marginal VFR for the Arctic coast, North Slope, south across the Brooks Range into the Kobuk and Selawik valleys. Otherwise, the Bering Sea pretty good. A lot of VFR out there for the Pribilofs, eastern central Aleutians. And for the Sunday morning time frame, IFR there for the eastern interior down in the Copper River Basin, marginal VFR for the southeast coast, North Gulf Coast, now across south central Alaska, and Prince William Sound extending down to Kodiak Island with marginal VFR across the southwest coast, right up into the Kuskokwim Valley, and marginal VFR central eastern Aleutians to about the Pribilofs, and also a band there along the western Arctic coast from the central Arctic coast southward into the Chukchi Sea. And for Sunday afternoon, IFR, Nunivak Island, the Pribilofs to just north of Atka Island in the central Bering Sea. A lot of IFR for Kodiak Island, right on up into the Prince William Sound area. And IFR, southern panhandle, better conditions to the north. Interior Alaska, back to mostly VFR from the Arctic coast right on down into Cook Inlet and Bristol Bay, as well as the Copper River Basin and the northern Bering Sea. Anatuvik, marginal VFR for the day tomorrow. Adigan occasionally marginal. And Lake Clark and Merrill, VFR becoming marginal VFR. Increase in moisture also for rainy coming in from the southeast, VFR flying to marginal VFR flying. And for windy, VFR to marginal VFR. Isabel, VFR to marginal VFR. And Mentasta, VFR becoming marginal as well. And for Tanita, VFR becoming marginal VFR. Portage, marginal VFR the entire day on either entrance. Chilkoot and White, marginal VFR. Freezing levels, 2,000 to 4,000 feet over the southern panhandle. At the surface, beginning to work back to the north a little bit there, but still south of Bristol Bay, north of the Pribilof, south of St. Matthew Island, and even south of the Kenai Peninsula. And for icing, batch of moisture into the southeast coast with southwest flow. We've got some considerable moderate, mainly down toward Dixon entrance, and possibly some considerable moderate rime icing up around the Yakutat area. Otherwise, just isolated moderate areas from the southeast interior and the remainder of the southeast coast, and some icing spreading up into Kodiak Island of the probably light variety, maybe some considerable moderate over the central Alaska Peninsula pushing into the Aleutian Range, but areas of isolated moderate rime icing for the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutians. And for the jet stream, we've got an upper level trough that's been pulling southwestward today, tonight, and the first center moves to Togiak Bay by tomorrow afternoon. Another center there up over the eastern interior, so southwest flow 75 to 80 knots there on the east side of that axis, and northeast flow 85 to 90 knots there, Yukon Delta in across the Seward Peninsula. 9,000 feet, 65 to 75 knot northeast winds there along the western part of the state into the eastern Bering Sea. Lighter southwesterlies in the Gulf there from Kodiak Island, 45 to 50 knots, and 50 knots up into the eastern North Gulf Coast. And at 3,000 feet, pretty good easterlies there, blowing right across out of the Kobuk Valley, Yukon Delta, 55 to 60 knots there, Nunivak Island area, about 40 knots for the southern Bering Sea, and 50-knot easterlies coming into southern Cook Inlet and Kamishak Bay, 45 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Turbulence, considerable moderate turbulence there, Panhandle, much of the southern Alaska, another branch up across the western Brooks Range to Cape Lisburne and Point Hope.
Floating hundreds of miles from Earth, astronauts get a unique perspective of our planet. While they might recognize landmarks, space is the only place they can see the very edge of our planet's atmosphere.
From orbit, particularly looking at the horizon, did bring to mind how thin the atmosphere is. It's like an onion skin around this great big ball of the Earth.
This uppermost layer of Earth's atmosphere, the ionosphere, also overlaps with the very beginning of space. It's the job of NASA's new mission, GOLD, the global-scale observations of the Limit-Disk instrument, to study this region, a region that isn't just for astronauts to explore, but that affects humans every day down on the ground. For one thing, this layer of the upper atmosphere helps protect us from harmful radiation and energy emanating from the sun. But in our modern society, it does so much more. It affects the smartphone that sits in your pocket and the radio waves that guide our airplanes. The ionosphere is a crucial layer of the atmosphere through which our communications and GPS signals travel. And when this region changes, it impacts those communication signals. Changes can occur above this region from the sun's activity, also known as space weather. Changes can also occur below from Earth's weather, such as hurricanes and wind patterns. Gold connects the dots between how space weather and Earth's weather shape the upper reaches of the atmosphere. But this region isn't easy to study. The ionosphere spans roughly 60 to 400 miles from Earth's surface, which is too high for aircraft and scientific balloons, and the lower regions are too low to easily study with satellites. What are attainable, however, are the swaths of red and green light shining out from the upper atmosphere. Formed when the sun's rays hit atmospheric molecules, this light, named airglow, comes from green and red bands of glowing gas. Some of the airglow is invisible to our eyes, shining in infrared and ultraviolet light, which can only be seen with scientific instrumentation. Taking advantage of our planet's natural glow is gold. The gold instrument, which is about the size of a mini fridge, is hitching a ride on a commercial communication satellite, SES-14. The satellite's orbit lies 22,000 miles above Earth, where it can record images in ultraviolet light to monitor changes in airglow across the globe. These images give information on the temperature, density, and composition of particles in the upper atmosphere. Gold collects these observations faster than any mission has ever done before. It captures an image of Earth's entire disk every 30 minutes, allowing scientists to see how the upper atmosphere evolves throughout the day. Gold joins a host of missions studying the very nature of space around Earth, the Sun, and planets. As NASA ventures farther and farther from home, knowing the nature of space itself is crucial for our journey to understand our solar system and beyond.
There's a new class of chemical compounds impacting the Earth's ozone layer and raising concerns among some scientists. But a new NASA analysis indicates stratospheric ozone could actually be impacted more by climate change and the continued release of already banned chemicals. The Earth's ozone hole is showing signs of recovery, decades after the landmark agreement called the Montreal Protocol that banned many chemical compounds harmful to the ozone layer.
So we know the Montreal Protocol was a huge success. This was signed in the late 1980s when scientists and policymakers from around the world gathered together to try to save the ozone layer.
The chemicals they regulated persist in the atmosphere for many decades. They thin the ozone layer and they create a seasonal hole over Antarctica. They basically take away part of our planet's natural sunscreen, and that increases the risk of skin cancer and damage to plants.
Scientists have projected the ozone hole could disappear almost completely by about 2075, but several factors could delay that recovery.
There are some industrial compounds that are not banned by the Montreal Protocol, but as they enter the atmosphere, they will also hurt the ozone layer.
But the unregulated compounds have a short lifespan in the atmosphere, unlike the chlorofluorocarbons that were originally regulated. So they have a short-lived impact on ozone, and we don't think they'll delay recovery by more than a few years.
We projected by 2050, more than half of the ozone-depleting compounds in the atmosphere will come from long-lived substances banned by the protocol.
Because these compounds stay in the air for such a long time compared to the unregulated, short-lived compounds, they will have a disproportionate and lingering impact on ozone. So any non-compliance with the protocol can have significant consequences.
And the really big uncertainty in ozone layer recovery is climate change. There are many naturally produced ozone-depleting substances that are emitted by the oceans. And as the oceans continue to warm due to climate change, those emissions will increase, and that will further delay ozone recovery.
Scientists want to better understand how climate change will affect ozone recovery.
This is a hard problem. As a scientific community, we need to work on this major issue. We now have a powerful new tool to simulate atmosphere and its interaction with land and ocean to study this issue. And that's what we're going to do.
How can can you see the atmosphere? The answer is blowing in the wind. Tiny particles known as aerosols are carried by the air around the globe. This visualization uses data from NASA satellites combined with our knowledge of physics and meteorology to track 3 aerosols: dust, smoke, and sea salt. Sea salt, shown here in blue, is picked up by winds passing over the ocean. As tropical storms and hurricanes form, the salt particles are concentrated into the spiraling shape we all recognize. With their movements, we can follow the formation of Hurricane Irma and see the dust from the Sahara, shown in tan, get washed out of the storm center by the rain. Advances in computing speed allow scientists to include more details of these physical processes in their simulations of how the aerosols interact with the storm systems. The increased resolution of the computer simulation is apparent in fine details like the hurricane bands spiraling counterclockwise. Computer simulations let us see how different processes fit together and evolve as a system. By using mathematical models to represent nature, we can separate the system into component parts and better understand the underlying physics of each. Today's research improves next year's weather forecasting ability. Hurricane Ophelia was very unusual. It headed northeast, pulling in Saharan dust and smoke from wildfires in Portugal, carrying both to Ireland and the UK. This aerosol interaction was very different from other storms of the season. As computing speed continues to increase, scientists will be able to bring more scientific details into the simulations, giving us a deeper understanding of our home planet.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. Looking at the sea ice analysis from Wednesday and then comparing it to today, especially up around St. Lawrence Island, you can see the westward progression of the sea ice here, going to the next frame, showing today's sea ice analysis. And solid ice now, or well, heavier ice out to St. Lawrence Island and now surrounding all of Nunivak Island as it continues to move west and to a certain extent southwest under the east and northeast winds, and that'll probably continue here through the weekend. And for the coastal water forecasts, look for south to southeast winds on the south coast at about 30 knots. Otherwise, north coast, good gales east of 40 knots with seas around 20 feet. Northerly gales continue for Lynn Canal at 40 knots and northeast 30, gust 45 for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, southeast winds 25 knots with 10-foot seas. And for Sunday, Clarence Strait, southeast winds 30 knots. Otherwise, northeast at 30 for Stevens Passage. Lynn Canal, north winds 30 knots, seas 6 feet. And for the south coast, full gales, southeast winds at 45 knots, and a full gale also for the North Gulf Coast, or for the northern coast, east at 40 to 45 knots. And Prince William Sound, small craft advisories for the day Saturday, north winds at 30 knots with 6-foot seas, and still strong winds for the eastern North Gulf Coast, northeast 45 with storm force gusts 65 knots, north 35 for the western North Gulf Coast. Gale warnings continue for southern Cook Inlet, northeast at 40 knots tomorrow, and 45-knot northeast winds for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. We'll see north winds at 30 knots. And then for the day on Sunday, for northern Cook Inlet, northeast winds 25 knots. Gale warnings continue. Southern Cook Inlet to Kamishak Bay for northeast winds 35 to 40 knots. For the Barren Islands and the western North Gulf Coast, gale warnings, northeast winds 40 knots. And east at 40 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound, winds will be northeast at 30 knots. Kodiak Island on Saturday, northeast winds 30 to 45 knots with 13-foot seas. And for the Alaska Peninsula, north to northeast winds 20 to 30 knots. And gale force northeast winds for Bristol Bay at 40 knots with 7-foot seas. Those drop down to about 30 knots on Sunday out of the northeast for Bristol Bay. Otherwise, Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, southwest winds 30 knots. Bering Sea side, east winds 25 knots. Kodiak Island, northeast winds of 40 knots, seas as high as 20 feet. Eastern Aleutians, north winds 25 to 30 knots. Central Aleutians, north winds 25 to 30 knots for Saturday. And the Western Aleutians, east-northeast winds 25 knots with 12-foot seas. For Sunday, Western Aleutians, north to northeast winds 25 to 35 knots. Adak and Atka, northwest 20 to 25 knots. And the Eastern Aleutians looking at west-southwest winds at 20 knots. For the southwest coast and Pribilof Islands, St. George, St. Matthew Island, St. Lawrence Island, all have gale warnings out for Saturday for northeast winds of 40 knots. And for the day Sunday, not much change, a little lighter though, but still gale force winds for the Pribilofs northeast at 35 knots. Same thing for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. North winds 45 knots for St. Matthew Island, northeast 45 knots for St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast and Norton Sound, northeast winds of 40 knots. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast for Saturday, east winds 15 to 20 knots. And for the central coast, lighter winds from the northeast at 10 knots, and northeast winds 15 knots for the western Arctic coast. And from Cape Beaufort to Wales, winds will be northeast at 30 knots. Spruce wind advisories continue into Sunday from Wales to Cape Beaufort for north to northeast winds at 25 knots. Lighter, though, on the western Arctic coast, northeast at 10, then becoming south at 15 for the central coast, and east-southeast winds 10 to 20 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. For tonight, snow continues to spread northwestward and westward into the southeast interior. Winter storm warnings out for heavy snow for just about all of the Panhandle, and wind chill advisories and high wind warnings continue for southern Alaska, although the blizzard warning ends at 8 p.m. for the Madanuska Valley, and the high wind warning for Valdez ends at 8 p.m. as well. And for tomorrow, snow and rain over the Panhandle, and then a big storm brings increasing winds to the North Gulf Coast with rain and snow for the southeast coast.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.